I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about L-Theanine for ADHD. The take-home message is L-Theanine is an amino acid that's abundant in tea and in certain kinds of mushrooms. There's numerous claims out there that it can help with depression, anxiety, attention, and it's often on the lists of possible supplements that can be useful for ADHD. There's a little bit of animal research that it's helpful as an antioxidant and anti-inflammatory, that has neuroprotective effects. But the ADHD and actually the whole human research body of literature is pretty small. ADHD, there's about 5 studies looking at it. It does seem to be safe up to 400 milligrams a day. And the evidence so far suggests that it may be helpful with sleep. It may improve sustained attention and reduce distractibility. But as the European equivalent to the FDA ruled a few years back, there's just insufficient evidence to support a claim that it's effective. I'd say, so there's suggestive evidence, there's anecdotal evidence, and my guess is it probably is somewhat effective, but the evidence body, as so many of the subjects we've talked about here, is moderately weak. So that's the take-home message. And to jump right into it. So L-theanine is an amino acid. It's not one of the 20 amino acids that is a building block for proteins in humans and throughout the animal kingdom. So there are many, many amino acids that are not constituents or basic building blocks of proteins. So this is a natural occurring amino acid. It's found in significant quantities in tea, and in certain kinds of mushrooms. It's not universally across all mushrooms, but particularly boletus mushrooms. And in tea, it's the taste experts or the nutritional experts are finding that probably L-theanine is what's primarily responsible for the taste of tea. There are somewhat larger amounts in green tea than in black tea. It's particularly high in matcha tea, but it's actually, the differences are in the range of 10, 15, 20% difference. It's not like a 5-fold difference. So you're getting a hefty dose of L-theanine if you're drinking cups of tea a day, whether they're green or black or white or matcha or others. They've actually found that tea shrubs, I would call them, that are grown in the shade have more L-theanine in them. And the part of the difference between green and black and other teas is first the leaves get fermented and then they get either dried or baked, and aspects of the fermenting process, which again, so green and black aren't different leaves to begin with. It's how they're treated or processed differently. And almost always you see theanine referred to as L-theanine. And just a short, hopefully, review of basic organic chemistry, that many molecules, because of the properties and the geometry of the carbon molecule, particularly many complicated organic molecules, exist as equal amounts of left-handed, which are usually designated with an L for levo or called sinister, versus an R for right-handed or dextro molecules. So the left versus right means that the configuration of the molecules are the same. So in my hand, my pinky is always over here. It's not stuck in the middle over there. But my left hand and right hand are mirror images of each other. I can't superimpose a left hand on my right wrist and expect it to function or look normally. So all of the amino acids that are used as building blocks for protein are 19 of them are L stereoisomers, so the left-handed version of the molecule. Glycine is one exception, and it's because it's such a simple structure. There's no way to make a left and a right-handed version. It's like ethanol. Ethanol is, there's no way to make a mirror image. The mirror image is itself, I guess you could say, as it were. That's a little important in that there's some suggestion that some fermentation, some processing, so in the natural plants, it's primarily L-theanine, but particularly some of the synthetic products that are out there or some of the processing. So the synthetic processes usually are starting out with a racemic mixture that's equal amounts of left and right. But depending on what precursors, how they prepare it, some of those are producing actually a predominance of right and L-Theanine. And there's extremely little research done on it, but what's done so far suggests that the right probably has much less, if any, biological activity. So that's something to pay attention to if you're buying a synthetic product, if whether it's saying just theanine, so a racemic mixture, which a racemic mixture is equal amounts of left and right, would only have half the amount of L-theanine in it. So L-theanine, when it's taken in by mouth, is absorbed within about 30 minutes. Half-life is only 1 to 2 hours, so particularly lots of the combinations of theanine and caffeine, it's lasting a shorter time than caffeine. And remember that half-life doesn't mean that's the elimination time or that all of it's gone in 1 to 2 hours. It means that every 1 to 2 hours, the levels in your blood, if nothing new is being added, are dropping by about a half. So structurally, theanine is very similar to glutamine, and in the brain, in the body, it serves as a reuptake inhibitor of glutamine. And it's important to distinguish. So glutamine is an amino acid. It's a precursor to both glutamate, another amino acid, which is both an amino acid and an important neurotransmitter. So glutamate is actually the most abundant, as far as we can tell so far, most abundant neurotransmitter in the brain. It's an activating neurotransmitter in most circumstances. And so glutamate's an extremely important and abundant neurotransmitter, but it's also not always benevolent. So much of when overexcitation of neurons occurs, some of the excitotoxic effects are pretty directly blamed for glutamate. So glutamate can be a good guy or a bad guy. And glutamate is also converted into GABA, which is the most abundant inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. So, and something like theanine, which interferes with, and some studies suggest it's both a glutamine and a glutamate reuptake inhibitor, but the action as glutamate reuptake inhibition seems pretty weak compared to glutamine. So within the brain, it's a reuptake inhibitor of glutamine. It has some direct effects, weaker than glutamate itself, on the glutamate receptors, so that it is a blocker of glutamate receptors in certain parts of the brain. It also seems to have neuroprotective effects, specifically on some of the GABA receptor systems. And in sort of summarizing across animal and human studies, L-theanine seems to also have antioxidation properties. So I have a talk on mitochondria and ADHD that's relevant to that topic. It has anti-inflammatory properties. We know inflammation's implicated in ADHD and a host of other mental health conditions. And there's fairly good evidence, preliminary evidence, that L-theanine has both neuroprotective effects and combating neurodegeneration effects. And in addition to that, the L-theanine doesn't just act on the brain. There's evidence that it's both a glucose regulator and can help with weight control. Other evidence that may be effective or have some anti-cancer effects and may be protective for liver and kidney. So getting back or focusing more on the brain, animal research suggests cats given L-theanine have become less anxious. Senile rats showed less brain atrophy when they're administered chronically L-theanine. And both rats and mice seem to be more focused and less likelihood of symptoms that are taken for analogs of depression behavior. And again, I said in humans, there's not a huge body of research, but what there are, and most of these studies have been pretty tiny. So there's a study of 27 individuals where L-theanine seemed to improve attention. And the important thing in this study is they looked at a few different dosage as the effects were bigger as the dosage went up, which isn't proof that this is actually having a cause and effect role, but it strengthens the case. There was another study just on 20 men given L-theanine in combination with caffeine, and comparing it to caffeine alone, it seemed to have an added effect on attention specifically. Another study showing a broader range of cognitive improvements, so better goal-directed attention, decreased distractibility, memory, but only done in 9 individuals. And then there's one of the larger studies in the L-Theanine field done in Japan. And Japan, I'll actually go why that's important. It's important because Japan has very high rates of background tea consumption, and none of these studies discuss or evaluate what the individual's background consumption level of L-Theanine was. Many of the studies specifically take people off of stimulants if they're looking at individuals with ADHD. Anyway, this study by Baba and his colleagues at the Japanese university looked at older 50 to 69-year-old individuals, 52 subjects, and looked at the combination of caffeine and L-Theanine and both the effects of a single dose and then 12 weeks of regular intake. Again, if we don't know whether these are people who are just effectively continuing their tea habit or whether some of them are switching from non-tea to a purified delivery of L-Theanine, that could be, different scenarios. And there's one other test, but basically they were using a Stroop test, which is a form of what's called a go, no-go test, where depending on what flashes on the screen, on a computer screen, you either have to respond, or if it's a different kind of stimulus, you have to not respond. And the groups, both acutely after just a single dose, but then if they were continued on it, this seemed to persist. There were more correct answers in response to the caffeine L-Theanine combination and fewer omissions, or fewer times they just forgot or didn't have time or to process and react. So again, some body of evidence, but not particularly extensive, that these L-Theanine can be of some help with attention processes in people without ADHD. So I think the biggest study I've found looking at L-Theanine and those with ADHD, I think it's actually as big as any of the non-ADHD studies, was one, it's an older study. It's 2011, conducted by Michael Lyon and colleagues at the University of British Columbia. And they looked at 98 boys with ADHDs. They were all male. They were all in the age range of 8 to 12. And they were either given for 6 weeks, either placebo or 200 milligrams twice a day. So 400 milligrams a day, what some might consider a large dose of L-Theanine. And then sleep was measured by a wrist epitograph. So a watch-like device that measured how active people were, which is a proxy measure for measuring what stage of sleep and how well sleep is going. And in this study, there was a significantly higher percentage of sleep efficiency measured by how much time once you fall asleep you are sleeping rather than tossing and turning was significantly better. Not only was sleep more consolidated or efficient once you fell asleep, there seemed to be, and this was not statistically significant, less physical activity during sleep, but the time to fall asleep, sleep latency, and other sleep parameters were not changed. And actually in this study, they found that the parents' assessment of sleep didn't particularly correlate well with the actograph. So their conclusion was parents really don't know how well their kids are sleeping or not. But again, it showed a fairly substantial, 400 milligrams is considered a big dose of L-Theanine. They didn't find any detrimental effects and some clear positive effects on sleep. And given that good sleep is one of the most valuable things anyone with ADHD can do for their sleep, this is encouraging. I think 3 at least of the handful of studies done in ADHD and L-Theanine have come out of the Texas Tech laboratory of, and I'm going to butcher his name, but try to say it, it's Chanaka Kahafudua. And one of the most impressive studies that gets cited a lot, although his research team itself labeled that this is just a proof of concept. This is not a clear proof that this is L-Theanine is working. It's a indicator from the positive effects that there is something worth studying further here, and a strong suggestion that this may be effective. So they looked at either L-Theanine at 2.5 milligrams per kilogram. So for the 80 kilogram standard American these days, that would be doses of just about 100 milligrams a day. So substantially smaller dose than what we know even kids in the other studies could tolerate. Or so the 4 groups, and each person served as their own control, and I'll get to why. There were only 5 people in the study, 5 kids. So they had an interval of time, I think it was 4 weeks, I don't have it in front of me, sorry, where they took either theanine, L-Theanine at 2.5 milligrams per kilogram, caffeine at 2 milligrams per kilogram, both of those together, I don't know how to say more, or just a placebo. And people were compared to themselves. There's a washout period in between tests that weren't informed, so it was randomized, blinded, which sequence of test situations or some drugs or supplements they were given or not given. But this consisted of sample size of just 5 boys, 8 to 15 years old, and what they were then put in a functional MRI machine, and while they were doing a go, no-go test, they were given another test to perform and a more extensive cognitive, they call it toolbox, which is a predetermined set of measures of different cognitive executive functions. Now, even though it's a tiny sample size, just in terms of body size, and part of why they administered dose based on milligrams per kilogram, is that the boys in the study range from 28 to 105 kilograms. That's about 60 to about 230 pounds. So very differently sized people. It's probably good that they adjusted dosage as a milligram per kilogram rather than giving a standard dose, because that's almost a 4-fold difference in body size. Who knows what they would have seen. And in the L-Theanine group, L-Theanine did seem to improve total cognitive scores on this composite set of collection of tests versus the placebo group. The combination of L-Theanine and caffeine also improved the total cognition scores to about the same extent. And both theanine and caffeine had a trend, well, caffeine clearly worsened the inhibition control, and that's been seen before. The caffeine, even at low doses for many kids, including kids with ADHD, can make them more jumpy, less able to control to inhibit the response to a stimuli. So caffeine worsened the response, and L-Theanine, it wasn't quite as strongly statistically significant, but seemed also to worsen inhibitory control. But interestingly, the combination of the two together showed a trend, and again, it wasn't statistically significant, but the two together looked like they were actually improving inhibitory control. So, I mean, the study adds to the potential for confusion in that often L-Theanine and caffeine are given together, and it's pretty clear that for some effects, they may be working together in concert and pushing in the same direction, and in other effects, they may be, again, they're often, L-Theanine is paired often with caffeine to help ensure or to block caffeine's sleep disruptive effects. And the other thing, given that they were looking at functionals, fMRI, so what the brain is doing, they found that the combination of theanine and caffeine together was associated with a decreased, while someone was working on a task, activation of part of the default mode network. So now, a default mode network is sort of the mind wandering, drifting off, not paying attention network. You would want that deactivated while you are performing a specific task, and people without ADHD seem to be more adept at deactivating the default mode network. So again, the combination of L-Theanine and caffeine in terms of a brain activation level seemed to be doing what you would want it to do, which was helping decrease activity in the default mode network when kids were doing a task. So again, overall, this is a pretty weak body of evidence. In 2011, and again, some of these studies have been done since then, but in 2011, the European equivalent of the FDA, and I might not find the initial, so it's European agency charged with sort of European Food Safety Authority, made an official decree that there wasn't evidence to support that L-Theanine helped with sleep, helped with cognition, helped with attention, or anything else. Again, that's not saying it doesn't help. It's just saying the state of the evidence at that time was so meager that it's not a compelling case. So my take-home message is, I think this suggests that it's purely a brain health perspective. There are probably advantages to tea over just coffee. And this is a gross generalization. I don't drink either of them myself, so I don't have a horse in this race. But if a patient came to me and asked which they should try, I would say L-Theanine probably is more likely to help in more different ways and less likely to be particularly disrupting sleep effects alone. But evidence is small. Hopefully we'll get more. Part of the reason there isn't a large body is, although there are some supplement makers who have funded some of the studies on L-Theanine, which is another reason to be somewhat questioning some of the results. Some of these were not funded by the maker. There isn't a big drug maker sitting there with a huge investment to demonstrate whether it works or not. So that's about all I will say on L-Theanine. I see at least some questions there, including some familiar names. Have I ever prescribed Valproate off-label for anxiety? Anxiety, no. One of the other uses for Valproate recommended by authorities, not an FDA-approved use, I'm pretty sure, as far as I know, is for sort of explosive temperament, explosive anger outbursts. And I have seen what appeared to be benefits there. There's been increasing push in the last few years that we should be focusing more on irritability as an important construct or topic to be paying attention to across a broad range of mental health problems. Most centrally ADHD and bipolar disorders. And again, there's some evidence that Valproate and maybe other drugs that were initially anti-seizure medicines may be particularly helpful in that dimension. I believe chronic taurine supplementation can downregulate GABA receptors. What about L-Theanine? This would be an absolute nightmare if people are downregulating their GABA for minimal benefits. Again, it's not an exhaustive literature. I didn't come across any. I didn't even come across any specific clear-cut mechanisms by which they think L-Theanine is having its protective effects on GABA systems. So I just don't know if anyone's looking at whether GABA receptors are downregulated or not. L-Theanine is often recommended along with L-tyrosine, another amino acid more centrally implicated in dopamine, norepinephrine, and even serotonin synthesis. And with tryptophan, the concern is two. One is, and it's more than 2 decades ago now, in the old dark days, most of the tryptophan used as supplementation was fermented by bacteria, produced by bacteria in cultures. And there was a manufacturer in Japan who is one of the largest manufacturers where their process got contaminated, and several people actually died from L-tryptophan supplements. That doesn't seem to be a risk, and the manufacturing process is differently now. There's also some potential concern. Could you create a serotonin syndrome by administering L-tryptophan with people who are simultaneously taking SSRI or other drugs. Theoretically possible. I do have a talk on this video thing on serotonin syndrome. For most people, you'd need to be taking pretty robust doses. So that's hasn't been a frequent problem in the actual world. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for asking questions. Let other people know about this. And I have a safe and positive week, and I'll be back next Tuesday.